Gratitude changes our brains, especially when we practice it often. It's scientifically proven that when we are thankful for something, our brains release two feel-good chemicals. One of them is called serotonin, the other one is called dopamine. And if practiced on a regular basis, our neural pathways are actually changed. And we end up focusing on what is going well in our lives instead of what isn't. So gratitude is healthy for us. It increases our mood and our motivation, and it also has physical benefits to us. It can boost your immune system. It can help you with energy and with productivity. So being thankful and being grateful is actually good for us all around. And it's Thanksgiving. And this text is one that is often used on Thanksgiving because it is an incident where someone came back and said thank you. And we could talk about that. We could talk about good manners. We could talk about being polite. We could talk more about the proven science of a gratitude practice. But I think there's more to this text than that piece. And I wanted to just dig in a little bit more to this very familiar text, I think, that we have today. One of the common themes in the Gospel according to Luke is that of inversion, of reversal. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first, and that kind of thing. We often hear in this book about an underdog being lifted up, somebody who has a dread disease or an affliction, someone who is very, very poor, somebody who is on the margins, somebody who maybe isn't of the normal culture or the accepted culture, someone who has a job that makes them an outcast, like a tax collector or a prostitute, someone who is widowed, someone who is a child, someone who is a woman, right? So we often hear about these things in this text, and we hear about Jesus coming in and stepping across any of those boundaries or borders, and we hear that miracles happen. And so time and time again, we find out that Jesus does that. He steps across the arbitrary borders and boundaries that humans make, and interesting things end up happening. If you noticed at the beginning of this text, and maybe you could flip back to the text, Jack, just for a minute. Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. And we could skip past this part, but I think this is where the meat of this text is. Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem through a region between Samaria, where the Samaritans were and still are to this day, and the Galilee, which is this lush valley around the Sea of Galilee where Jesus did a lot of his ministry. And this is a borderland. And Jesus was going through this part on his way. And you might just skip over that first little bit, but I'd like you to consider this. There is a writer and an activist called Gloria Anzaldúa, and her context is the U.S.-Mexican border, and she talks about borderlands, and she talks about borderlands being psychic, cultural, and social places. I'm going to read what she says so I don't mess it up here. She says that they're more than a geographic boundary. They are these psychic, social, and cultural terrains that we inhabit and that inhabit all of us. And she says we set up borders, the borderline, to show who is safe and unsafe, us and them, right, to separate that. But the borderlands are these undefined places in between. These places that are vague and undetermined and that are created by emotional residues of unnatural boundaries. Just think about that. Emotional residues of unnatural, arbitrary, human-made boundaries are these borderlands. And the inhabitants of the borderlands are the prohibited and the forbidden people. The prohibited and the forbidden people. And so that's where we set this scene, is this borderland between these two places. And there were 10 people who lived there, and these 10 people had this dread disease. So leprosy has an interesting history. It's ancient. Leprosy has been around for years and years and years, and still to this day exists in several countries. In as recently as 1985, there were 122 countries still dealing with leprosy. They figured out how to treat it and cure it for the most part in the 1940s. But before that, we would shun people and put them in colonies. Have you heard of that? There's a very famous one in Hawaii called Molokai, an entire island. There's a movie that's fabulous about this. And they would put people there and just let them be there. And to this day, if you are under 19, you can't go to Molokai because they say it's in the foliage and it's so it's not safe to be there. Did you know we had 2 leper colonies in Canada? We had one in New Brunswick, and we had one right here in BC. Anybody know where it was? Darcy Island. Darcy Island is one of our southern Gulf islands that is part of the Gulf Island National Park. Is it a national park? Provincial park. But it is entirely within one of the Gulf Island parks. And it was a leper colony for a number of years, from the 1800s to the early 1920s. So these people would have had sores all over their body because it's very visible, this disease. And they would have been exceedingly poor. They would have been untouchable, so nobody would go near them. They probably would have been hungry because they couldn't work. And they would have been shunned by anyone they encountered because it was very, very visible. And one of them, at least, was a Samaritan. What does that mean? Didn't everybody love Samaritans? No. Right? We hear about the good Samaritan because presumably all the rest of them were bad. Right? So Samaritans, there was a very deep divide between the Jewish people and the Samaritans that goes back to the patriarchs, back to the time of Jacob. So this was like a feud that was generational, that went on and on and on. And so you did not speak to a Samaritan if you were Jewish. Now, what was Jesus? Jewish and a rabbi, right? Interesting. But what happened then? So a Samaritan who had leprosy would be even like hooped, right? Completely doomed. So they see Jesus, and somehow in this borderland space, they knew who he was. They'd heard about his teachings. They'd seen what he had done maybe, or heard about what he had done. And they did a couple of things of note here. They did not swarm him. It says they stood a respectful distance, keeping their distance so that they didn't infect him, which was polite, right? Nice. They did that. They called him master. When you call someone master in the time of Jesus, you were a disciple of them, or at least you respected them. You knew that they could teach you something, and you were a willing student. Remember, Samaritans, a Jewish person, right? This is big. And so they said, Master, have mercy on us. Have mercy on us. So what did Jesus do? What did Jesus do immediately? He said to them, go and present yourself to your priests. Did he ask them who they were? No. Did he ask them where they lived? Or who they lived with? Or who they loved? No. Did he ask them to stand in line and fill out a form in triplicate? No. He didn't do anything. He didn't ask them anything at all. He just said, go and see your priests. And as they turned and went, the sores started to go away. And they were singing and dancing in the streets. And one of them, the Samaritan no less, turned around and came back and said, thank you. The Reverend Francisco Garcia says this, and I'm going to read this again so I don't mess it up. He writes that Jesus often pays attention to the margins in his ministry. He calls Jesus the ultimate border crosser, which is true in many ways, right? The ultimate border crosser who models for us a prophetic and pastoral ministry where he continuously shifts the focus away from people and places that are held as sacred and worthy, and instead goes into the margins. He actually reframes the margins of society, the borderlands, the places where God actually shows up with healing and liberative power. He reframes the borderlands. So there is more to this story than being grateful and saying thank you. There is much more to it. What is happening here, what we are figuring out, is that our God, through Jesus, tramps all over the borders that we make up, the boundaries, and goes across them and is found in unexpected places. And our God who does this does it with mercy for all, offers justice to all, offers compassion and kindness and love to all. And that is a miracle, I think. That is amazing. So we as followers of Jesus are required to do this, to seek justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with our God. May we always be grateful. Amen.